This is Manjot Kaur in the studios of Punjab Lalit Academy. Today, in conversation with Ashima Raizada under the video archiving project. Ashima Raizada is an artist working in multiple disciplines. Hi Ashima.
Hi, thanks.
Tell me about your journey from being an engineering student to being an artist.
That goes back to the second year of my college. I just felt that the routine life in college was very mundane for me, and I would say that pushed me into taking photographs, and that's where it all began. So I was interested in the idea of light and shadow play initially. So, and also I would use my phone to take those photographs, and whatever subjects I used to find, usually the subjects that I would take up were at my home only, my mother or any help or anybody who was around the house, and I would look out for different corners in the house to understand this light and shadow play and put them as subjects in between. Then eventually it moved on into more of an aesthetic exploration where I was going out and seeing the architecture around and then taking those photographs accordingly. And then eventually, as this process kept happening, I started building up my own personal narrative into it. So the images became more personal. I was talking about more about what I was feeling rather than what was I was just seeing around. And then I also started dabbling with paints, and then eventually there was a little bit of interest that was developed in the areas of drawings and paintings eventually.
Did you like sort of try to educate yourself in what is happening in the field in contemporary art and
That
also
was
in the history of art?
that was later. Eventually, it was just my own interest and exploration and my own understanding of it. So I would keep myself a little detached from that part. But then over the time, once I had made up my mind that I want to pursue a career in this profession, I started keeping track and keeping myself educated about what are the contemporary practices and
Mhm.
what are the different ideas that are being and different concepts that are being implemented in the kind of work that is happening in the art field today.
How was your mind thinking when you first painted a canvas?
It was I s- I think it was just a very it was definitely a very haphazard way of working around with the canvas initially.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't trained to know how to use the brush or the knife or even the paints for that matter. So whatever I thought could be done with them, I did it.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that was a very it was a very new experience, but I was very engaged with it because I felt that I could work around with it,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the reason I just kept doing it. So eventually, it was more practice and more understanding
Mm-hmm.
of how to work around with different tools and different things that were available around.
So how does materiality plays role in your work?
So initially, materiality was more about understanding the compositional part or the aesthetic parts of the works that I was making, because I wanted to first of all understand that how the different elements or how the uh, different parts are put in a space and how they work together. So that was how I was using materials initially. But now, over the time, materials have started symbolizing something. Like I've started
Sorry,
using,
before coming to symbolizing, I would want to ask you,
yeah,
like, please tell me about your materials, what your materials are.
yeah. So I was using a lot of paper initially. So I was working with the paper as well as pasting a lot of paper on the canvas. I was working with a lot of metal. So I was applying a lot of metal sheets
Were
on the
you also
canvas
using
itself.
color?
What color, as in?
Like, were you also applying paint?
Obviously, I was using a lot of paints. I was even using crayons for that matter. So I still use crayons because I just enjoy working with them. and the other materials that I was using were just found objects, maybe like different things that have fallen off. They've just fallen off or they're on the road. So I would collect those things and just apply it. And then now, when I see it, now I've started using a lot of plastic in the work. Again, it's a found thing. And I feel that I use the word symbolism simply because now I feel it comments on the current situation of how the society is, with the abundance of plastic around and the plastic epidemic that's happening, that it's become a found object, that you can see plastic.
Are these your very recent works?
These are very recent ones, yeah.
Coming back to your very initial works where you were actually working only with paint, color,
and paper, yeah, mostly.
Paper and also canvas, I believe.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So also you state that colors had a lot of symbolic importance for you.
Definitely.
Where do you find this symbolism? Do you follow any sort of studies to devise out the symbolism, or is it like a completely personal approach to look at
it's
it?
both, actually. I won't say it's simultaneous, but it's definitely both. I do study about, I have studied about color theory, and it's a very, I would say it's a very, for me it's an evolving process, because at one point of time you understand a certain theory about a color, but over the time, as your mind develops further, your understanding of that color changes, so you are then using that color in a different context. So like in the recent works, I've used the color gold a lot. So also because of the kind of concepts that I was working around, because gold as it is symbolizes higher knowledge, illumination, and the context of the work that I was doing was in reference to it. So that's how I think of color symbolism, all in reference to the work that I'm doing, and even otherwise it's for my own personal understanding of how it affects your disposition and how you understand.
So there's this like reading your artist statement, it says that your work tends to go towards abstract expressionism. That is something which happened like long time back in Western history.
True.
Living in India, how do you connect with that? Also coming from a non-artist background, doesn't it seem to you that sort of it is a bookish knowledge that has come into foreplay in your works? In a way.
Bookish knowledge, I would not say that, because the thing is, when you start making work, so you, and I mean when you start it, you analyze your own work, and you first of all you make it, and then you also try to understand that where does it stand in this whole history of art that has taken place or is also currently taking place. So I just felt that it does fit into that bill of abstract expressionism, and even though it's obviously an old movement, because we are living in the post modernism movement where everything is pretty much everything is a mixture, so nothing is like, there's not a particular movement that's going on, everything is mixed and matched within itself.
I believe, like, as in being in the contemporary scenario, one cannot just identify what's happening right now.
Exactly.
It's like when 20 years has passed, only then one is able to actually realize,
Exactly.
what were the actual trends,
Yeah.
that was going on at a
Exactly.
special time. So my point is also that you're trying to label yourself under abstract expressionism.
I actually never said that it is abstract expressionism. I said it oscillates between the two movements, which is the combines movement and the abstract expressionism. And I think it does create its own visual language, and it might as well be a category in itself. I mean, because I am not just simply defining it or pushing it in one category. I am just saying that it does take references from those movements, and that it does follow certain characteristics that those particular art movements have rendered those artworks to. So that's how I
coming
see
back to the symbolism in color,
Yeah.
there's this painting of yours, where you call black as a mode, black
yeah.
as a method, black as a way of
way of
being.
being, yeah.
Can you elaborate this more?
Yeah, so when I worked on this painting, I was thinking a lot about the color black and the different connotations it has in the society. So like growing up, would I would always hear people say that black is a very negative color. Even in religious context, it's not considered a very good color. So that would always make me wonder that why any particular color has that sort of a connotation in the first place. Because for me, I feel differently about it, and I had a different opinion about it, and I just wanted to express it maybe through a painting. So I started working around it. And I felt that since it's one of those colors, scientifically speaking, that absorbs all the colors, so it pretty much has everything in it. So when I say that it is a way of being, I'm just, I think, referring to that quality it imparts, which is that despite of having everything inside of it, it maintains that stillness and composure. And I think that's what I really mean when I say that.
Also, your works also tend to have a lot of abstraction. You know, how do you land to this abstraction? Is it only as like, can I only just only look at it as a way of like you're experimenting with color and you end up, you know,
No,
making
I don't
shapes or
think so.
colors? Like,
No.
yeah, what it is? Please tell
So,
us.
what I understand about abstraction, or what I understand why I work with it, is because I feel that abstraction is very fundamental to the existence itself. Uh, before before meaning comes abstraction, you know. I would also like to use a quote here by Morris Dennis. So she says that it is very well to remember that any picture before it is a battle horse or a nude woman or an anecdote, it is basically a flat surface covered with color and assembled in some order. So abstraction comes before meaning, before you're assigning the meaning to it. So it's very fundamental in nature. And the creation itself is very, again, abstract. So I think that's how I am approaching this particular methodology.
Coming to your experiments with photography, as you said that you were doing while in your college,
Yeah.
you seem to sort of engage with two frames and then
Yes,
combine both of them. What is
definitely.
about
Yeah,
using
so
two frames?
like initially when I started off photography, I did mention earlier that it was more of like an outdoor thing for me. So I was basically witnessing or understanding the external environment and the things that were already present there. So they were like single images, and there wasn't like a series that I was working on. I was just taking images, I was just being a witness, I was just, you know, as they say, freezing the moment in a very layman way. But eventually, I wanted to make it a more personal uh, medium of expression. So that's when I started combining two images because I wanted to add a larger narrative to it. So I make these diptychs basically because these two images, which have been taken at very different points of time, I feel there is an interconnectedness between them. It could be aesthetically, or it could be in the concept that I have in my mind when I'm combining these two images.
Tell me about your concepts.
So the concepts usually, I won't say concepts, but I would say the thoughts or the ideas that I have on regular basis, and they're usually derived from the conversations that I have with my friends or what I'm noticing around that is happening in the system that we're living in. It could be as simple as an observation, like I made a particular collage which says into the wild digital era. So the first half is basically an animal and the other half is a pixelated image, and that's how I've combined it. So I'm just basically commenting on that how in this post-internet age or in this digital era, how we are completely overwhelmed by that wave. So it's these little observations here and there around that I like to sort of convert them or translate them into this particular form.
Coming to your series where you talk about I scream, I rebel, I rebel, I
Rebellious,
scream.
yeah.
What are they about?
So it was a work that was basically about understanding the process of unlearning. So what I've noticed or what I observed is that, like, you go through life, but you go through it from a certain mental structure, and that mental structure that you have is formed or borrowed from maybe your parents or from your society. It's not an independent set of, it's not an independent thinking basically. So I was basically trying to unlearn a lot of things at that point of time, and that process, as I like to call it, is basically like deconditioning of the mind, or the disintegration of the old mind, where it gives space for the new things to come in, or the new information to form in, where you can have your own individualistic approach or your own understanding of the world. So in those works, you must have noticed that there is a very evident expression of scream, which talks about uh, being very uncomfortable, being in that situation of transition. And there is a box where the face is partially inside of it and partially outside of it, which basically shows that
Do you
transition
also talk
happening.
about sort of like, are you challenging the norms of patriarchy and hierarchy prevalent in the society?
Yeah, definitely. Because you are a part of a system, and everybody somewhere in their head wants to, uh, if not rise above it, but do feel a sense of freedom despite of being in the system.
How do you think about feminism in this context?
Feminism,
Yeah.
I think it's an extremely important movement uh, in the current situation, because of how the way the suppression and oppression of the women have been in the society for a very long time, and finally seeing them believing in themselves and coming up and standing up for themselves is absolutely necessary in this point of time.
And how like do you like how do you think it is prevalent in your personal life or in your specific personal actions?
I think because I think it, from the fact that I decided to pursue something very different from what I was supposed to pursue according to my family or how it was initially. So it was definitely difficult. I did get support. My father was very supportive, but otherwise it was a difficult decision altogether for them to uh, wrap their head around. So I do feel that it was somewhere there, and I did feel that it was important for me to keep at it while working towards it.
Tell me about your eye drawings.
Eye drawings. So the idea of eye drawings was very vague when I started off, but I think the whole concept really developed when I was in Thane for the Piramal Arts Residency. Uh, the space itself, I think, really helped me to solidify the concept, because it was a very isolated space, and the area where we were living was completely natural and very raw, and just like few meters away there was a lot of construction that was going on. So I think when I talk about the coexistence of opposites, that's what I'm actually referring to. That two very contrasting situations are existing together in one space. So when I talk about eye drawings, I basically mean that, or what I'm referring to is that these systems that I'm making, which can be structural or which can be organiforms, are very aware of themselves and of the surroundings that they're in.
You also talk about that you're talking about living things and non-living things, and
Yeah.
how non-living things tend to become living.
No,
What
it
it is
doesn't
about
tend to
this?
become living. I'm just challenging the definition of, or idea of, how do you categorize a living thing and a non-living thing. I mean, just to simply say that buildings or structures or anything of that sort is lifeless is based on what? Is based on a certain definition of it. But how far is that definition valid? So, in the work that I was doing with these drawings and all, I was just basically exploring that idea that these structures or these inorganic forms, as such, they have an energy inflow which is within them. So I do feel that there is some element of life which
But
is
then
there.
in this case, this chair does also have an energy because this is wood, and if you burn it, there will be definitely, some
Yeah,
energy that will.
definitely.
But then, would you call this also a living thing?
Yeah, why not?
You also talk about consciousness, when you, while working with your eye drawings, eye becomes for you the symbol of consciousness.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate more on that?
I have always been, I as a symbol has always been about observing the environment. It has always been about uh, taking in all the visual information that there is, and then, it acts as like a medium of that passage of knowledge, which, or that passage of information that you have. So by adding, I think I was just playing around with the idea of symbolism there, and because I wanted to make that idea of consciousness or awareness very relevant in those drawings, that is why I started playing around with those eyes and adding them on the work.
It seems like play is very important part of your work. So while you are painting, what kind of decisions do you take?
While painting, what kind of decisions I take?
Yep.
Can you give more context to this?
For example, do you have a theme which is already ongoing in your mind, or the first, form comes and then you actually decide what your painting will be about? So while you are painting, do you stop yourself at a certain point, or that you have to, because you also talk about space at a lot of times,
Yeah.
that you manage space. So all these decisions, that how you're going to apply paint, where you're going to stop, how the space is going to become an important part of your work, where there's going to be negative space, all the formal aspects of the work.
Yeah.
Naturally, a painter is,
Yeah.
very much aware of, when he or she is painting.
Yeah, true.
So how is the process with you?
The process is always initially a little chaotic because you start off, there's always an idea that's there, there's always a theme that is there in my head, uh, but I think I let the painting or the work that I'm making organically grow, because, and at some point of time I do know where to stop, and I know that it's done there, and this is where it just makes sense to me. So those kind of decisions, yes, are obviously taken during the process, but it's also, I think the process of painting is also a lot about, at least in my personal experience, it's a lot about fixing up also. I mean, you make something and you don't like it, and then you again try to fix it, and then you make more over it, or you layer it further, and then you don't like it, and then you again try to fix it, and you keep fixing it to a point where you feel that, yeah, this is done, and this has come to a point where you can say that it's complete.
So tell me about the very recent work that you did for the workshop on visual imaging, making visual imaging, organized by Punjab Lalit Kala Academy.
Yeah, so I basically made 3 sets of work. The first was about tracing the 5 journeys or the udasis of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. But I wanted to create those geographical spaces, not taking references from any map or any existing locations. I wanted to create my own geographical areas. So I used maps, I used tracing paper, I used graphs, and there were a lot of mark making and gestural marks on those different works itself, where I traced those areas where he had been, and where he spread those messages of love and peace and equality. And so this was one set of work. And the other set of work consisted of 3 drawings, which were entirely and purely based on the teachings, on his teachings and his philosophies. Uh, and the last set that I made was basically a painting on linen, and it was based on the story where he was 3 days, the story of 3 days in a river, where he would usually go to take a bath, and but this time he didn't return, so he went into the jungle, and when he came back, he was a changed man, he was an enlightened man. So that was the reference for making these works.
Is research an important part of your work?
Yeah, definitely it is. When I talk about research, or when I think about research, not just that I am scrutinizing a particular subject factually, to its length and breadth and width. I also like to give myself some space to understand what I have gained from it, or what insights or what understandings I have from it. So I do like to give myself that space where I can interpret from what I've learned. So it's just not very factual, or it's not just very, I would say, direct that way. I like to just make my own interpretations and understanding, and then probably translate into work.
It's been not a very long journey that you have been an artist as of now,
Yes.
and then there already like seems, you know, the graph, the line on the graph is like really going up. Looking at the stylistic changes that
Yes.
have happened in your work,
Yes.
what do you have to say about like how do you view painting, you know, in this timeline of a few years?
Yeah, so the way the painting has evolved over the time, it's very interesting because now, since we are in the digital era and everything has been digitized, or everything has been so technologically oriented, so finding traditional methods of paintings or sculpture in that situation is very, it just it does fit and it does not fit. So that evolution itself is very interesting to see. So now, I always feel that I just don't want to make a painting in its traditional form, and one of the reasons for applying a lot of materials to a painting in the first place is because I just want it to be an intermediate. I don't want it to be entirely one thing,
Hmm.
because when I apply materials, it does not technically stay a painting and not entirely a sculpture.
Hmm.
It is somewhere intermediate, and that might be a category in itself. You never know. So I think that's interesting, that how you can use the traditional forms that have always been there to explore and experiment and use your own understanding, and then just distort and disorient it.
As you say, like you read a lot. Any of your favorite writers or your favorite artists, you know, whom you follow?
Yeah, I would not say I follow, but I do like to see their work or understand why they're doing it. And I think from India, one of my favorite artists is Bharti Khair.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love her Bindi works. I think it's the way they have been made, the thought process behind it. It's wonderful. And I also like S.H. Raza's work,
Mm-hmm.
and F.N. Souza's work, and Atul Dodia's work.
Mm-hmm.
Internationally, I would say Robert Rauschenberg has
Mm-hmm.
been someone I've looked up to, and I also like to understand. I actually was very fascinated that why is he doing this in the first place. There's another artist that I'm very fascinated by, which is Mark Bradford,
Mm-hmm.
and I also read a lot about Mark Rothko's approach towards his practice
Color
into
field
this color
paintings.
field paintings.
I would like to know your views or sort of like your experience on how do you feel, you know, being a woman in this society? How do you think we are placed? Being an artist, you know, also you think that the situation sort of has improved. Also, like living in Punjab, you know, where there's not only gender equality inequality but also this difference in gender ratio.
Yeah.
What do you think on this?
Uh, I feel as a society we have a long way to go
Mhm.
in terms of giving that equality to women. That long due equality to women is gonna take its sweet time to happen, because the movements, it's just now that the movements have taken, or they have accelerated or gained momentum. It has been happening for a while, but now it's just now that we do see some effects of that, these revolutions that have been taking place for a while. As a woman, before, as a woman, I like to think of myself just as an individual, and then, despite of having that sort of a mindset and being very, I would say, neutral about it, I still get subjected to all sorts of things that generally women do get subjected to, which I find very, I would say, disturbing in a lot of ways. So I think it basically is just how the conditioning has been all this while, in not just in I would not target men here, because it's not really just about men. It's also about women here.
Yeah.
That how they have
This sort of conditioning the minds of their
yeah,
daughters.
I mean, you know, like you grow up, you know, there is a very evident difference in how a daughter is being brought up and how
Yeah.
a son is being
Yeah.
brought up. You know, there's certain set of rules different for a daughter, and some rules are different for the son. That itself is a problem. That's where it
That's
all
true.
starts,
That's very
right?
true.
So I think when it is relevant, when it is there, it will keep propagating. It will never end, because it keeps passing, just like how it has been passing from the generations.
Do you think all these things that bother you also tend to enter up your work?
Now they have started to enter in my work, because I feel that now I've become more conscious of it. So I wasn't really focusing myself on that part, but now I think I feel that mentally I am very conscious of it, and now it has slowly and steadily started entering in the work. So while I was making work for the visual imaging workshop, so while I was doing these drawings, then while I was reading Nanak Dev Ji's teaching, so he talked very wisely about the status of the woman back in 1500s, which was very poor. So I kept thinking to myself that even though it was poor back then, it's still not that great right now, the way the situation is.
Also, like I think that we talk about Western society, you know, which
Yeah.
is sort of like very empowered society. I see similar sort of similar sort of events taking place in their society as well.
True. I think it's just a very false impression that because it's a foreign land and because they have a good economy, yeah, it does have its benefits, but certain root problems they never go. And that's where I think as artists, uh, see, artists are more interested in dismantling the mental structures than the power structures.
Thank you so much, Ashima. It has been lovely talking to you all
Thank
this
you.
while. Thanks for shedding light on your work, on
Thank
your
you.
process, and on your themes.
Thanks a lot.